Hello again. So today I want to talk about how we form beliefs in the context of it being a few days or a week after the kind of Plandemic conspiracy video circulated, and then there was a lot of kind of refutations and pushback, and a lot of people had a lot of feelings and thoughts, and there were a number of very long and aggravated discussions on social media. So I'm not going to get into like what that video was or refute the content of it, because that has been already done to death. But the thing is, I want to talk about why the way that not just media outlets and social media platforms and the way most smart people think that misinformation and disinformation can be dealt with it's not as effective. It's based on a paradigm that is only partially true. And so, yeah, basically, there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there, and it's increasing in content or it's increasing in quantity, and social media platforms are kind of becoming aware of this, and they're combating it in their own internal ways. But the way that the public is being told, how to be more aware of it and counter it is based on a certain conception of the human that believes that we're highly rational, and not just highly rational, but that like reason will prevail, where it's based on this idea that the smart people vet all of their information all the time, and that is just simply not how people actually behave. So much of our beliefs and so much of where we know we can believe things and where credible sources are come from the networks that we're surrounded by, and how many of our peers believe this or that or the other thing. And I think there's probably some very real like business reasons that social media companies like Facebook will not probably ever acknowledge this, because they do operate a platform that decides what you see based on what's gonna like make your heart beat faster and what's gonna like make you want to like type rapidly into their platform. And yeah, that their business model is predicated on us kind of like not being rational creatures. And so it's best if that is kept out of the spotlight, and then highlight, like you should be more rational. You should do this, that, and the other thing. But the thing is, when you're exposed to information, you're largely going to determine how valuable that is based on your social network. You're not actually vetting every single thing all the time. You might do that when you encounter a new source of information, but you probably are not going to do that every single time always, because that's just like very energy intensive, very time consuming. So for instance, like if I read something in the New York Times, I am highly likely to believe that all the content in there is correct. And that's because I trust the New York Times, and largely that's because the New York Times is socially trusted amongst the circles that I'm in. I can't practically thoroughly vet every single thing and fact check every single thing back to its original source myself So at some point, things just become trust networks. Now, that's a simple example, but then when it comes to newer sources of information, it becomes a little bit trickier, and because there are so many new sources of information, that becomes very tricky. I was also reading this. This is one of my new favorite magazines, Nautilus. It's like a science magazine that does some like long-ish form writing. And so in there's one article that is an interview with a guy who wrote a paper on measuring and mapping scales of cultural and psychological distance, which is basically a fascinating thing about how when you, like, so many psychology studies are done by like sort of testing undergrads on their beliefs and reactions to things. And that's not actually a representative sample of the entire world. So this mapping project basically compared and contrasted using surveys the worldviews of different people. But it's a fascinating conversation in itself. And in there, he talks about how certain traits and certain beliefs will actually cluster around each other. And so there's this quote: "A lot of our beliefs are about signaling our membership. They were acquired from who we consider to be successful or prestigious models, or copied by the majority of people within our social groups. So you can get this artificial clustering simply because the prestigious models are pushing idiosyncratic things." And then he gives an example where he says, "One of my favorite examples of this is vaccinations and homeopathy. Homeopathy is basically about taking a little bit of something poisonous to make you better and stronger. Logically, this sounds a lot like vaccinations to me. A little bit of something bad makes you well. But even though there might be this tedious logical connection, if you believe in homeopathy, you probably also are anti-vaccine." That's just using the data to see who correlates, which beliefs correlate with one another. And this really gets to the core of this idea that we don't form all of our beliefs, or even the majority of our beliefs, based on thorough vetting of everything that pertains to that belief, but rather the networks and the sort of like trusted figures and trusted institutions that give us those things. So one example I actually know about, I found out about recently because I read a lot about disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda, as of recently, is something called Operation Infection, and that's infection with a K. This was in the 80s. And what this was done by the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union, now Russia, has been engaging in what are called active measures, which are information warfare tactics that they misinform the public of different nations in ways that will benefit the state, the Russian state. So one that was highly successful in the 80s was called Operation Infection, where they planted some false information in an Indian newspaper that was pro-Soviet, that the U.S. military had created the HIV virus, and then it had gotten away from a lab, and that was what caused the AIDS epidemic. This is false. This is not true information. But it was so successful because the way that information flowed, it just kind of like went everywhere and then crisscrossed back, and everything, like papers were referencing another paper which referenced another paper. So it became really hard to find where the original source was, and the original source was bunk. It was a Soviet news plant. But eventually, I think in 1987, it had sort of bounced around so much that on CBS Nightly News, Dan Rather actually reported that story to the American public. So, see, in this case, CBS News is highly credible, and if you hear something from there, you're likely to actually think that that is definitely the case and not vet it. Just as I would probably do for if I read something or heard something in a New York Times podcast. So with that, there's no real amount of vetting that you can do, or there is, but it's highly impractical to the point where it's impossible. There's so little ability for you to thoroughly vet that information as a citizen, that you're not going to be able to figure out that that's false. This is a different kind of understanding of how we form beliefs than, we're just highly rational and we'll thoroughly research everything. What you actually need are just better cross-referenced information networks where entities are checking each other constantly, and it doesn't have to be individual people. It probably, for practical purposes, has to be institutions, like journalism outlets, that are checking each other constantly. And what I think is the reason why the Plandemic thing really burst forth was not because anyone was being less rational than always, but rather because it was a type of information that appealed to a lot of people's emotions and pre-established worldviews, kind of across the political spectrum. There's a Facebook extension that it's an extension owned by Facebook, but it's not a Facebook extension. But it allows you to see which Facebook pages are linking to if you go to a web page, you can click the extension and it shows you which Facebook pages have linked to that page. So when I was going to the places where this Plandemic video was uploaded, I was finding that it was Trump rules was the number one, and then QAnon official page was number 3, and it was a lot of far right stuff, but it was being posted by my friends that were very, very on the left. And I think that is actually the reason why the video became so popular, is because it transcended political boundaries. It resonated emotionally and with the pre-established worldviews of so many that their networks were yeah, this seems like a thing that could be true. It wasn't about the vetting. It was more about the networks, and also the way that the social media sites work is if a whole bunch of people are linking to one thing, then the algorithms are going to be that thing is important. I'm going to show more people that. That whole thing is a complex problem that I'm actually writing something about. I might do another video on, but I just wanted to point out in this video that if we approach the problem of misinformation and disinformation from this mindset that we are these lofty, abstract thinkers that are able to set aside our emotions, and then we can absolutely just take in the pure facts and trace them back to their source, well, we're gonna lose the fight. We're gonna totally lose the fight, because people don't do that. A more realistic way to approach this would be to say that people have these worldviews and these networks, and from those, if information is put into your system that floods your network and resonates with your worldview, then you're likely to just take it and then either repeat it verbally or share it on social media. That if that's the model that you're operating on, then you actually have a chance at combating misinformation and disinformation, where it is clear that that is not the model that social media sites are operating on, and that is not the model that like smart people with their like Medium articles are putting out there right now, and that's concerning to me. So that's all for today.